H.O. is the real King Harold. Fact, fiction, and freakish family drama. Harold Godwinson, that unlucky last Saxon king of England, wasn't born with a crown on his head, but his family certainly had a talent for grabbing power like a toddler snatching sweets. Around 1020, in the green heartlands of Wessex, Harold was likely born under the watchful stone eye of a Saxon church that doubled as both a place of worship and a lookout post for Viking raiders. A baby boy raised where sermons and swordplay went hand in hand. This was no gentle age of lullabies and warm milk. It was all chainmail and church bells. His dad, Earl Godwin of Wessex, a man so politically slippery he could have sold sand to a Saxon and still walked off with the land rights. Godwin had risen from the minor ranks of the aristocracy to become the biggest fish in the English political pond. How? Tenacity, ruthlessness, and a touch of Viking swagger. Yes, you heard right. Our English hero Harold was half Viking. His mother was Danish. His brothers were named Sweyn and Leofwine, not exactly names you'd find at a Morris dancing festival. With the fall of the Danish Empire in England, and the return of the exiled Edward the Confessor from Normandy, yes, the Edward who looked like an English king but talked like a French courtier, Harold stepped onto history's stage. Edward needed powerful friends. Who better than the Godwins, England's top dogs? To cement this alliance, he married Harold's sister Edith and promoted Harold to Earl of East Anglia. It was the medieval version of giving your in-laws the corner office. At this point, Harold was in his prime, blonde, bearded, bursting with charisma, and backed by a personal army. He was the image of a Saxon noble and a star on the rise. But Harold's family? Oh boy, think succession with swords. Enter Sweyn Godwinson, Harold's big brother and England's answer to a Viking rock star gone completely rogue. Sweyn kidnapped a nun and held her as a sex slave, which went down about as well as you'd expect in devout Christian England. Exiled to Denmark, he was such a pain that even the Danes tossed him out like last week's fish. He came crawling back to England in 1049, and Harold was furious. Why should a failed Viking playboy get land back that Harold had dutifully managed in his absence? Cue a family feud worthy of its own soap opera. Sweyn begged for forgiveness. The family met him at Pevensey. Picture it. Stormy coastlines, clifftop drama, and Sweyn pulling one last stunt. He convinced cousin Bjorn to plead his case to the king. But when they got to Bosham, Sweyn murdered Bjorn, tied him up, dumped him in a hole, and scarpered. Even the sailors called him a nithing, the Viking equivalent of unclean scum no one will share an ale with. Sweyn fled to Flanders, hated by everyone, even the local seagulls. Back in England, King Edward was no fool. He saw the Godwin family as a necessary evil, but he was also quietly building his own faction. Norman clerics, slicker than eel grease and just as trustworthy. Enter Robert of Jumièges, Archbishop of Canterbury and master manipulator. One chronicler said he had so much influence over Edward that if he pointed to a crow and said, "That's a swan," Edward would nod and applaud. Robert hated the Godwins and probably whispered into Edward's ear nightly, "Harold's getting ideas, sire. Big ideas. He might even try to be king." The plan? Undermine the Godwins, piece by piece. In 1051, things got spicy in Dover. Edward the Confessor gave a very peculiar order. He wanted his most powerful earl, Godwin of Wessex, to punish his own town. That's right, Edward told Godwin to go to Dover, a place practically built by Godwin's ancestors, and make an example of it for daring to resist some of Edward's Norman pals. Now, imagine you're Godwin. You've raised families there. You've drunk mead there, and now you're being asked to burn it to the ground? That's like being told to slap your grandmother at the village fair. Just unthinkable. Godwin was cornered. Loyalty to his king or loyalty to his land? Godwin, true to the rebellious spirit of every decent medieval power broker, chose rebellion. Godwin didn't go quietly. He rallied his sons, Harold included, and tried to call an emergency summit with the king. A medieval intervention, if you will. But Edward had backup. The other barons, many of them Norman imports, who smelled more like cheese than loyalty, stood firm behind their saintly sovereign. And just to rub salt into the wound, Edward refused to give Godwin safe conduct to the meeting. Translation: come to my castle, but also maybe get stabbed on arrival. The Godwins weren't stupid. They fled into exile. Imagine the headlines: most powerful family in England boards boat, heads for exile. King Edward shrugs. But oh, how the tables turn. 10 months later, after every noble in England realized, wait a minute, if Edward can banish Godwin, then we're all toast, messages of support began crossing the channel. The Godwins, political exiles turned rock stars, sailed back like conquering heroes. Harold and Godwin moored at Southwark on the south bank of the Thames. Across the water sat King Edward, no longer a picture of divine right, but more like a monk stuck in a chess game he didn't understand. There were no bridges then, just boats and pride. Enter Stigand, the Bishop of Winchester, ferrying back and forth like a holy Uber driver, negotiating peace and humility for the king. Eventually, Edward capitulated. The Godwins had their lands restored. Norman advisors were booted out, including one delightfully shady archbishop who killed a few people before fleeing, and England briefly remembered who really ran things. Victory was sweet. Humiliation was Edward's. But fate, like politics, had a cruel sense of timing. Within 6 months, Godwin was dead. His other son, Sweyn, was too. Which left Harold Godwinson, the last man standing. He wasn't just Earl of Wessex now. He was the king's right hand, commander of the army, a political juggernaut, and an earl with more lands than you could ride across in a week. And, perhaps more importantly, he was dangerously competent. But when Robert of Jumièges, that slippery archbishop, had fled to the continent, he took hostages with him, Harold's younger brother and nephew. He handed them to his new patron, William, Duke of Normandy. And those boys, languishing in Norman dungeons, became the medieval version of nuclear launch codes, because William saw them as leverage. Harold had the crown in sight, but he also had family imprisoned by a man who thought England should be his. Uh-oh. Next came the Welsh problem. Specifically, Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, the man who'd somehow united all of Wales, a miracle on its own, and decided it was high time to poke England in the eye. Edward had foolishly placed Herefordshire in the hands of Ralph the Timid. Yes, that was his real name. Shockingly, Ralph's forces got flattened. The Welsh burned the minster, laughed all the way to the hills, and Ralph probably wept into his fancy Norman cloak. Enter Harold, England's MVP. He charged in, didn't just stop the raids, he redefined English military tactics. Harold realized fighting the Welsh in their hills was a bad idea. You get bogged down, picked off, and sent home in pieces. So he launched a lightning-fast Saxon commando raid, the medieval equivalent of SEAL Team 6. He bypassed Hereford and went straight for Gruffydd's castle, shock and awe, Harold style. Gruffydd ran, but Harold wasn't done. In Phase 2, Harold's brother Tostig raided by land while Harold came by sea, torching every stronghold the Welsh thought untouchable. In the end, Gruffydd's own people sent Harold his head in a box. Game over. Now Harold was more than powerful. He was loaded. Estates in the south, lands on the Welsh border, a glittering lifestyle. He loved hawking, the 11th century version of driving a Ferrari. He traveled with birds, had the finest collection of hawking books in Europe, and probably looked magnificent doing it. He also had Edith Swan Neck, a woman of beauty and brains. Unusual for the age, they had an actual romantic relationship. Historians say their bond lasted till his dying day. Like all rich men, Harold funded religious institutions to polish his image and bribe heaven. Inspired by a supposed cure from paralysis at a shrine in Waltham, he built Waltham Abbey, a magnificent church adorned with relics, golden altars, and robes stitched with 8 kilograms of gold thread. Harold was living large. He had the land, the army, the love, the church, the people. What could possibly go wrong? And then came 1064. No, let's start in the year 1051. King Edward the Confessor, England's famously celibate king, made a curious promise. To whom? To William, Duke of Normandy, a distant cousin, and a ruthless warlord with Viking blood not tea in his veins. Why did Edward do it? Well, maybe Edward was grateful. Maybe he had visions of a Norman-style England. Or maybe, just maybe, he didn't expect to live that long, and William was the most terrifying insurance policy a childless king could have. But hold on, the official version jumps straight from this 1051 promise to 1064, when Harold Godwinson is sent to Normandy to confirm it. Neat and tidy, right? Not quite. Because in 1056, sandwiched right between the promise and the oath, Edward made another royal power move. He sent Harold on a long, expensive East European road trip to Hungary. Why? to fetch Edgar Atheling, a teenage heir from Edward's own bloodline, the last of the royal house of Wessex. Edgar had been chilling in exile with his mom like a forgotten Game of Thrones character, and now suddenly he's summoned back? If Edward truly wanted William on the throne, why bring in Edgar? Sounds less like a promise and more like Edward hedging his bets with a royal game of who wants to be my successor. Fast forward to 1064. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful noble in England, brother-in-law to the king, and a man with the jawline of a Shakespearean hero, sets sail across the Channel. His official mission? To swear allegiance to William. The real mission? Likely very different. A dozen years earlier, Harold's brother and nephew had been taken as hostages by the Normans, a friendly Norman custom that translates to, "You behave in England, or we start mailing you nephews in pieces." Harold wasn't traveling to make friends. He was heading into enemy territory to get his family back. But fate had other plans. A storm hurled Harold's ship off course like a Viking frisbee, and he crash-landed in Ponthieu, which, in medieval language, meant, "You're now a hostage of a baron who likes ransom." To William of Normandy, the White Knight in chainmail, who rescued Harold and promptly placed him in golden captivity. Harold was now a guest, in the same way a goat is a guest at a lion's birthday party. Now comes the part where medieval history takes a page from Marvel Comics. The Bayeux Tapestry. This 70-meter-long Norman-commissioned masterpiece, basically an 11th century graphic novel, tells the story with all the subtlety of a propaganda poster. Commissioned in Bayeux, sewn by English hands and displayed for French eyes, it shows Harold being wined, dined, knighted, and tricked. He joins William on a military adventure in Brittany. He saves Norman knights from quicksand like some medieval Baywatch hero. And in return, William takes him to Bayeux Cathedral and pulls the biggest con since the Trojan horse. "Swear loyalty to me," William says, on this box. What Harold doesn't know? That box is a reliquary, filled with sacred relics. Oaths sworn on relics were considered legally and spiritually unbreakable. Breaking it wasn't just lying, it was spiritually explosive perjury. Harold, likely under pressure and knowing he wouldn't be allowed to leave otherwise, swears the oath with the 11th century version of crossed fingers behind his back. The classic yeah, sure thing oath. Just as Harold returns to England, probably feeling like he narrowly avoided a royal disaster, his little brother Tostig, Earl of Northumbria, decides to double the taxes in the most rebellious region of England. Bad move. Northumbria had a long history of enjoying low taxes, Viking raids, and not listening to London. The result? On October 3rd, 1065, a full-blown noble revolt. Tostig's armory is looted, his men killed, and the rebels demand Lady Godiva's grandson, yes, the Streaker's kin, as their new leader. Edward sends Harold to fix it. Harold now faces a choice worthy of Shakespeare. Back his brother and risk civil war, weakening England against the very real threat of a Norman invasion. Or side with the rebels, remove his own brother, and save the kingdom. Harold chooses England. Tostig is furious, goes into exile, and joins forces with Harald Hardrada, the fearsome Viking king of Norway. Yep, 2 Harolds, for the price of 1 invasion. It was supposed to be his big moment. Westminster Abbey, the jewel of King Edward's pious little heart, was finally complete. A massive, Romanesque monument to God, monarchy, and Edward's very clear desire to look good in history books. Nobles had gathered from all across England, polishing their finest cloaks, ready to kneel, pray, and maybe grab a few selfies, or scribed sketches, of the grand consecration ceremony. But Edward, poor man, was having none of it. On Christmas Day, 1065, as nobles were toasting to God and gossiping in the cloisters, Edward collapsed. Just fell ill and spiraled downward fast. It wasn't a dramatic poisoning or assassination, just good old-fashioned medieval deterioration. He lay in bed, pallid and pious, drifting in and out of consciousness, while people debated whether to mourn him or push on with the abbey opening. Spoiler, he never saw it. Instead of opening his abbey in glory, Edward managed to close his life in the most inconvenient way possible. On January 4th, 1066, just 2 days before the grand consecration. It was like commissioning a Rolls-Royce and dying before you ever sit in it. But wait, the drama only begins here. As Edward slipped into the great beyond, he pulled one last royal rabbit from his dying hat. He changed the succession. The official heir, Edgar Atheling was technically next in line. But the kid was, 15? With the facial hair of a choir boy and the military experience of a spoon. Worse, every foreign warlord with a pulse had their eyes on England. Edgar? Easy meat. So Edward, perhaps sensing the chaos to come, supposedly grabbed Harold Godwinson's hand and whispered the medieval equivalent of, "Tag, you're it." And just like that, Harold, Earl of Wessex, rich, experienced, battle-tested, and about to have the worst year of his life, was now the people's choice for king. Luckily, all the big-shot nobles were conveniently gathered already for the abbey's opening, so it turned into an impromptu funeral coronation double feature. On January 6, 1066, Westminster Abbey hosted 2 royal ceremonies in one day. Edward's funeral, tears, incense, probably a choir that sounded like angels. Harold's coronation, cheers, trumpets, and a collective, "Let's not die in a foreign invasion this year, please." Let's be honest. If you were English in 1066 and not foaming at the mouth, Harold was the only logical choice for king. The man had everything: wealth, fame, military experience, and a killer mustache. More importantly, he was already in the room when the decision was made. But not everyone was thrilled. Across the channel in Normandy, William the Duke, the man Harold had once sworn loyalty to on holy relics, mind you, was out in the woods, hunting deer and enjoying his Duke life when news arrived. Your boy Harold, crowned king, like 2 days ago. William, to his credit, didn't scream or kill the messenger. No, he simply went home, sat down, and steamed. Legend has it he stared into his cloak for hours, forehead pressed to a pillar, quietly whispering Norman curses like perjurer, traitor, crepe stealer. Then came the decision. If Harold wanted the crown, he'd have to keep it, because William was coming for it, and he was not coming quietly. Now, here's where things go full Game of Thrones. William didn't just write an angry letter, he built a war machine. Starting at the mouth of the river Dives in Normandy, the man commissioned a fleet of over 700 ships. We're talking industrial-scale warfare. Entire forests were chopped down, 60,000 trees, give or take a squirrel, and about 8,000 men got to work, hammering, sewing sails, and building the medieval version of D-Day. Still, people weren't exactly queuing up to die for William. At first, recruiting was tricky. Hey, you want to go fight the strongest kingdom in Western Europe? Was a tough sell. Enter the Pope. Yes, the actual Pope. William convinced Rome that Harold's coronation was a sin, a perjury, and a moral outrage. With this framing, his invasion became a holy war, a crusade. Suddenly, knights who were on the fence started polishing swords. The Pope even gave William a banner and let him carry one of the holy relics into battle, the very one Harold had sworn on. Suddenly, Normandy was buzzing. Bakers, boatmen, bishops, blacksmiths, everyone was in. Back in England, Harold wasn't sipping mead and admiring his crown. He knew William was coming. He had every able-bodied man stationed along the southern coast. All summer they waited, sunburned, restless, hungry, but the winds refused to cooperate. William's fleet sat in Normandy, tied up like ducks in a pond. Then Harold made the one decision fate had been begging for. Let's send everyone home for the harvest. Boom. The coast was clear. But plot twist, it wasn't William who struck first. From the north came a different storm. Harold's exiled, bitter, grudge-holding brother Tostig, teaming up with the towering Harald Hardrada, king of Norway. Harold was a Viking war machine, over 6 feet tall, with the reputation of a Scandinavian Chuck Norris. Together, they brought 7,500 seasoned warriors, sailed up the River Ouse, and captured York faster than you can say by Odin's beard. England had just been sucker-punched, and Harold had to act fast. Now, Harold could have waited, regrouped, or even prayed. But no. Instead, he pulled off one of the greatest forced marches in English history. 190 miles, 25 miles a day, barely stopping to breathe. He gathered troops as he ran, surging up the Great North Road like a caffeinated juggernaut. By September 25th, his exhausted army reached Stamford Bridge and caught the Norwegians napping in the sun, many without armor, their ships miles away. The English burst through York and charged across 6 more miles to Stamford Bridge. As Harold's forces crested the hill, their swords glinted like a field of broken ice. The Norwegians scrambled to form a defense. One hulking Viking held the bridge alone, chopping down 45 English soldiers like a medieval John Wick, until an English spearman swam under the bridge and stabbed him where the sun doesn't shine. Then it was war. Shield walls, sword swings, and blood in the mud. The English crushed them. Of 300 Norwegian ships, only 24 returned home. Bodies piled so high that 60 years later, bones were still visible from the road. It was an extraordinary victory. Harold allowed the survivors to leave, provided they pinky promised never to come back. They never did. But just as Harold sat down, sweaty, victorious, and probably halfway through a celebratory roasted goose, a rider burst in. "My lord, Normandy has landed." William, finally blessed by the winds, had crossed the channel and touched down on English soil. It's like you've just beaten the final boss in one video game level, and now a secret level opens with a bigger boss, better armor, and French cavalry. Harold looks around at his exhausted troops, mutters something in Old English that probably translates to "Are you kidding me?" and begins the 250-mile march south with blisters, banners, and blind faith. Meanwhile, Duke William of Normandy wasn't just landing, he was unleashing. The Pevensey marshlands were a soggy death trap, so he moved his forces to the dry, defensible hills near Hastings and started burning the surrounding countryside, like a medieval arsonist with royal ambitions. Why the delay in crossing the channel? Historians say the wind wasn't favorable. But come on, let's be real. William was waiting. He knew Harold Hardrada was attacking from the north and wanted Harold nice and worn out before his real test began. The guy was playing chess while everyone else was chucking spears. Harold, still high from his northern victory, rushed south, leaving behind much of his army. His elite warriors, the housecarls, followed him. The rest? Well, they'd already earned their meed. He picked a perfect defensive position on a ridge near a place called Senlac Hill, a name that sounds like a sleepy village but was about to become ground zero for a bloody page of history. He rallied his troops at a spot famously called the Hoary Apple Tree, not because it was magical, but because once history unfolded here, that poor tree was about to be immortalized in blood and poetry. And eventually, a stone monument and a gift shop. It's the morning of October 14th. At 9 a.m., the Normans sound their trumpets. The battle begins. William's infantry struggles uphill, their armor weighing them down like medieval gym bras doing squats and chainmail. At the top, Harold's Saxons beat their shields with axes and screamed battle cries like a Viking rock concert. In the center, Harold bellows "Holy Cross" as the Normans smash into a wall of steel and stubbornness. And guess what? The Normans break first. Word spreads that William is dead. His left flank panics, especially the Bretons, and begins to flee like sheep chased by angry cows. Harold's men, thinking victory is theirs, break ranks to chase the retreating Normans. Big mistake. William, who is very much not dead, lifts his helmet to show his men he's alive and rally them. The Saxon pursuers are cut off, surrounded, and butchered. William sees opportunity in chaos and orders feigned retreats. Run away, lure the Saxons downhill, then turn and charge. Over and over again. Harold's shield wall begins to crack, not from force but from human nature. Every time they fall for the fake out, more Saxons die. The battle drags on. 9 hours. Most medieval battles lasted 2, but not this one. This was the Wembley final of medieval warfare. Night was closing in. If Harold could just hold for another half hour, reinforcements might come. The Saxons were so close to winning until a new player entered the chat, Norman archers. From the bottom of the battlefield, they fired volleys into the air, not at the shield wall's front, but into the sky. One of those arrows finds its mark, Harold's eye. Yes, that arrow. The one every schoolchild learns about, the medieval equivalent of a sniper headshot. But the arrow didn't kill him immediately. Some sources say Norman knights finished the job, cutting him down amid his last defenders, who fought to the death around their king in a circle of courage and carnage. The field was soaked in blood, and Harold's body was so mutilated that they couldn't identify him. That is, until Edith Swan-Neck, Harold's longtime partner, came and found him among the heaps of corpses, recognizing him by certain marks only she would know. Yes, that's as intimate as it sounds. Harold's mother offered his weight in gold for the body. William refused. Why? He didn't want a Saxon martyr's shrine becoming a tourist trap for rebellion. Some sources say Harold was buried by the sea. Others say he was taken to Waltham Abbey. But one suspicious grave in Bosham shows a headless body with a missing leg or two. Sounds familiar? Well, the Bayeux tapestry shows one leg being cut, but later accounts say 2 legs were gone, and the head too. Coincidence? Maybe not. Bosham just happened to become William's personal estate, where he could keep an eye, pun unintended, on the resting place of the last English king. Harold wasn't just a man who lost a battle. He was England's last native king. He represented a civilization that had lasted 500 years, with its own language, laws, and culture. And while the Norman-Saxon blend would eventually produce Shakespeare, Churchill, and Marmite, it also created a permanent ruling class who spoke French and ruled over a people they didn't understand. Harold's death didn't just end a dynasty, it began a new one, in a foreign tongue. So next time you see a posh accent or a confusing law about fox hunting, thank the guy who took an arrow to the eye in 1066. Harold the hero, England's last king who refused to quit. Don't forget to tell your viewers to subscribe for more bloody, brilliant, and battle-tested history.